In classic Battletech, the record sheet is a form that players use to keep track of the technical specifications and the current state of their Battlemechs or their other military units. At a glance, the record sheet provides all of the necessary information about the unit's armor, speed, weapons, and equipment, as well as what DACA that it's bringing to the table. Not only is it the standard by which damage and other things are tracked in the game, it's also an oft underutilized way to strategize against your opponent. Since its inception in Battle Droids in 1984... Yep. This was an actual record sheet that, at one time, was used to play Battletech. The Battlemech record sheet has undergone more changes than you might think, and it's really not uncommon for me to encounter players out in the wild who just don't know how good they have it with things like Flex Sheets or Megamech Lab, but Battletech record sheets today are more accessible than they've ever been.
I'm firing angrily at the ground.
But it might shock you to learn that it wasn't always this way. No, back in the early days of Battletech's popularity, all record sheets had to be filled in by hand, and had to be done so according to the technical data for the mech in question, which was included in the early rulebooks to give players the basic information they needed to know to get started. This is also why technical readouts were popular in the early days of Battletech. For a while, these were the only way to get information about new mechs, which you would then have to transcribe over by hand. Okay, so now that I've set the stage for you, let's cover part 1 of this journey. The 80s! The year is 1984. Battletech 1.0, then called Battle Droids, is released. Inside, players are greeted by a softback, double-sided rulebook, which contained the first practical application of the modern Battlemech record sheet, with instructions on how to fill them out. The players would simply look at the technical data contained inside the rulebook for whatever mech they wanted to use, and the rulebook would explain how to extrapolate that data onto the record sheet for gameplay. After finding a way to make copies of the blank sheets, the player would then fill in the boxes of armor and structure they did not intend to use with a pencil or a pen if they worked carefully. So, for example, if a unit carried 15 points of armor in a single location, the player would leave 15 boxes blank to represent the location's armor and fill in all the rest as unusable for that chassis. The same process would then be applied to the internal structure in accordance with the mech's technical data. Once this process was complete, the players would then write in the weapons and ammunition the mech carried, which was all listed at the bottom of the unit's technical data for ease of reference at all times. At this point they were finished, and all there was left to do was to add their characters' gunnery and piloting skill scores, and they were on their way. And as an aside, how gunnery and piloting skill worked back then was absolutely bonkers. So if you want a video breakdown on that whole business, leave me a comment. Once the players did this for every mech they intended to field, only then could gameplay commence. And that's just how the game was played for a while. Now you'll notice there isn't a room for a weapons inventory on these, and all of the information about the unit is to the right of the sheet. That's just where it's going to stay for a while. Thankfully, however, in 1985, after the game had been renamed to what we know it as today, the record sheets got a little bit of a facelift. Even though the process for using them was the same type of carpal tunnel-inducing drudgery as Battle Droids, it was Battletech's 2nd edition where the record sheet began its first step out of the water, and began to approach a resemblance of something we would recognize today. But one of the versions that tends to get buried a lot in this whole thing is really the little guy, the guy who should least be getting buried, and this is what I like to call version 1.2. New players would be given a chameleon to pilot for starters, and the chameleon chassis is the famous silhouette that would represent the armor diagram for quite some time going forward. Let's fast forward the tape a couple years. Whether the Battletech reinforcement set was a response to a customer demand or just a clever way to sell their first ever pre-generated sets of record sheets, I'm not really sure. But with the additional cardboard standees like what came with 2nd edition, a book of pre-generated record sheets was also included. You can tell these come after 2nd edition, but prior to 3rd edition due to the header of the two being so similar. Now, players didn't have to spend hours painstakingly filling in bubbles by hand, and for the price of a photocopy, could also stop staying up late nights filling them out in the days before the game so they'd be ready when it was time. It's interesting to note here that these sheets are apocryphal now, as they were printed under the old heatsink allocation rules, which, if you're not familiar with those, you can see a full breakdown on this video, which I'll put up on the screen for you now. Okay, back to the record sheets. Astute players will notice right away that weapon information such as heat, damage, range brackets, and the like are not present in the weapon inventories of these sheets. So this meant players using them either had the statistics of these weapons committed to memory, or they were beholden to the rulebook until those stats became part of their memories. Players often photocopied the back of the 2nd edition rulebook to laminate it and use as a handy-dandy cheat sheet so a rulebook wouldn't have to be constantly flipped through and referenced during gameplay. Ammo also wasn't noted on the critical hit table and had its own section above the number of heat sinks instead, which were also not numbered and had to be counted out and notated on the sheet by hand if the player was of the proclivity to save time. Complaints aside, the sheets were playable, worked, and met a need. But you know what I think is really weird about these? When they started making these, you'll notice that the armor bubbles are always either perfectly spaced out or in weird patterns whenever that can be done. You'll notice that same trend continues for a while before they quit that practice altogether. And if I'm being honest, I kinda miss it. It's like they were playing a game to see how symmetrical they could make all the dots. The Reinforcements set had a sequel in 1990, the creatively named Reinforcements 2. Now this is where shit starts to get duck tits bonkers for a while. With Reinforcements 2, they started moving things around and just putting them in plain old weird spots. Huh? What? Why is that there?
That don't make no damn sense.
I'd imagine there's some sort of reason. Maybe they just thought it would make the game more interesting to mix everything up. But either way, I believe you can still use these sheets today, as they contain things like clan mechs, clan invasion technology, stuff like that, which would have all had to have been printed after the rules for heatsink allocation had been changed, which is another phenomenon we discussed in the same video from earlier, so I'll throw it back up on the screen here, just in case you didn't click on it before. I just think it's funny that the great houses ostensibly have these bazillion-dollar R&D budgets, and it's all foiled when the game developers are just like, I know. One thing Reinforcements 2 rectified from the previous edition was record sheets for quads were now notated, and even though they were still on 2 legs as far as the armor diagram was concerned, at least it was labeled properly and the critical hit table done the same way as well. Some other minor cosmetic changes and noting double heat sinks were the only other noticeable changes. Outside of those, these are pretty much equivalent to the original product, and as such, I really consider them to be more of a product of the 80s than I do the 90s, despite the fact that this was printed in 1990. Alright, Battletech fans, I sure hope you've enjoyed this little trip down memory lane here with us. We've got the 90s coming up next, and if you like this video and you want to see that one when it drops, do yourself a favor, hit that subscribe bell down there and turn on all notifications so you don't miss a minute of the boisterous Battlebound action. Folks, Battlebound has a Patreon. I'm going to put the link right here at the bottom of the screen. That's how we continue to keep making great Battletech content for fans just like yourselves. So do yourself another favor before you leave. Sign up today, enjoy those benefits tomorrow. I'm Tuck Davian, and we'll see you next time right here on the Space Lanes.
Be sure to smash our like button and subscribe to our channel.
Crowdfunding is when lots of people give you small amounts of money to help your passion project come to life.